I want to welcome all of you to our first Impact Symposium. And let me begin by thanking my dear colleagues, beginning with Dr. Amalia Mora, who just very graciously enabled us to begin, who has worked so tirelessly in preparing this symposium and who has been such a source of inspiration over the course of the time that we've been working together. And our other dear colleague, Maya Ferdman, in the back. Maya, we've been together in a number of different professional settings, and it's such a real pleasure and honor to have you with us here at ISH, which is how we refer to the Initiative to Study Hate. So do not be alarmed if you hear repeatedly this acronym ISH. It stands for the Initiative to Study Hate. I want to say a word about the initiative, so some of you who are not familiar have an idea of what it is. The initiative is a 3-year pilot project that brings together researchers from more than 20 disciplines and departments across the UCLA campus, with the purpose of marshaling the diverse research tools that we have to understand hate and figure out how to mitigate it. We are currently in year 2 of the pilot, and we have supported, over the course of that time, 33 research teams and created a community of some 70 researchers, a number of whom are with us here today and from whom we'll be hearing. Now, when we embarked upon this initiative, we were daunted by the enormity of the task. Hate, writ large. Were we going to solve it? I'm pleased to say that there was some measure of epistemological modesty about the limits of what we could know and what we could come to know and do. But at the same time, we felt, to borrow a wise ancient teaching, that we were not at liberty to abstain from trying to know more and do more. And so, over the course of the last 2 years, we've been meeting on a monthly basis to pursue questions of common interest and share research findings. Our goal has not only been to understand hate better, but to find ways that may mitigate it. And it's that which leads us to today's event. As I said, our first Impact Symposium, which is really the first major public outing, gathering, at which ISH researchers share their findings and discuss what those findings might mean for society at large. Today's gathering brings together members of the ISH community, but also external partners with whom we have established relations, highly skilled practitioners in the work of combating hate. We'll hear from some of those partners on the 2 panels that will open and close today's symposium. And just to give you a sense of the structure of today, in the middle, we'll have the opportunity to hear from 5 ISH research teams. Should you forget the structure of the day or want to be reminded or otherwise distracted, you can scan these QR codes in order to get the program so that you'll have a sense of how the day will unfold. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize representatives from some of those external partners with whom we've had the privilege of collaborating, nonprofit and governmental organizations, including the California Commission on the Study of Hate and the California Civil Rights Department, the AAPI Equity Alliance, NewGround, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, the Civil and Human Rights Department and Human Relations Commission of the City of Los Angeles, the Western Justice Center, Facing History and Ourselves, the LA LGBT Center, the Anti-Defamation League, Stop AAPI Hate, the LA County Board of Supervisors, LA versus Hate, the Pritzker Foundation, and last but surely not least, USC. There's no intentionality in my placement of these various organizations. I'm also really delighted to welcome our dear friend, the Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA, Dean Abel Valenzuela, who has been such a source of steadfast support and his son or sons. Yes? Yeah, great to have you with us. So we have to acknowledge that these are unusual and very difficult times on our campus. The environment since at least I just mentioned USC, by the way. I've got to laugh at that, but I'm delighted to see you here. The environment since the terrible events of October 7th has been fraught, and many members of the UCLA community feel a sense of insecurity, sorrow, anger, and grievance. In the midst of protests and counter-protests over the devastating war in Gaza, and especially in the wake of April 30th, we have seen the ugly face of hate, hateful violence, and rhetoric on our campus. The hate has contributed to the unraveling of trust, indeed the compact that binds us together as members of the university community. And so we have, I think, direct exposure to the corrosive effects of hate. In this regard, I do want to recognize that we are in the midst of a strike on campus by the United Auto Workers, representing teaching assistants who are seeking redress for the events that took place on those terrible days of April 30th, May 1st, and May 2nd. A number of those who plan to be here with us are not because of the strike. And I want to acknowledge their absence and express my appreciation for the work that they have done for the initiative. And I hope that the strike will be resolved in a fair, just, and expeditious fashion. We here at UCLA have a very large task ahead of us to stitch together anew the fabric of our community. One perhaps surprising, counterintuitive way we can do so is by joining forces to study and diminish hate. It's really deeply gratifying to see how the ISH research community is committed in its sense of common purpose and spirit of goodwill as we push ahead in our shared quest. And I really want to thank members of that research community for being such committed, devoted, and wonderful partners as we embark on this important and meaningful path together. The problem we face beyond our campus is one of scale and intensity. There's a large and growing ecosystem of hate in this country, and for that matter, in the wider world. Group-based animus has grown exponentially over the past decade, and it often seems like a contagion, even a pandemic, as the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, declared several years ago. I want to offer two caveats in making this statement. First, hate is not an all-inclusive explanatory framework for all forms of bias or prejudice. There are deep structural forces of discrimination that operate without the fuel of hate. They're sustained without the fuel of hate through their own institutional logic. And second, hate is notoriously elusive to define. It calls to mind Justice Potter Stewart's famous but not fully satisfying aphorism about obscenity. I know it when I see it. Psychologists Robert and Karen Sternberg remind us that hate is much less satisfying and more difficult to study than love. And yet, they add, and here I'm quoting, "It is difficult to think of any other problem in the world that is more costly in terms of lives and resources." And so we join our colleagues around the country at the University of Pittsburgh, at Carnegie Mellon University, at Bard College, at Gonzaga University, and many other places around the country, the continent, and the world in applying our considerable research energies to understanding this phenomenon that so vexes and consumes us. Without further ado, we're going to begin our deliberations. The arc of the day quite logically begins with a panel on what is hate. As I mentioned, we'll then move to a presentation by ISH researchers under the rubric, What Does Hate Tell Us? And then our final panel will continue the conversation in a more informal way at a reception to which you're all invited. As I said, you can keep abreast of where we are by scanning the QR code. I should also tell you, I don't know if we have signage to this fact that there is a call for proposals for members of the UCLA Research Community on the QR code?
No, on the slideshow.
On the slideshow, okay, on the slideshow. And last but not least, I want to call your attention to our new-ish blog, Notes from the Study of Hate, curated by Dr. Naomi Tao. Hi, Naomi, from whom we'll hear a little bit more at the end of the afternoon. Okay, let us now begin. I'd like to invite the first set of panelists to come up now to begin our conversation about what is hate. That would mean Howard, Aziza, and Matt. And I'll briefly introduce them, and then we will jump into a conversation. I think we have another microphone that we can use. Okay, I'm delighted to welcome three colleagues and friends whom we'll be talking with about this question of what is hate. Let me begin by introducing my dear friend, Aziza Hasan, who is the Executive Director of NewGround, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, a national model for building authentic relationships, productive engagement, and social change between American Muslims and Jews. Welcome, Aziza. Next, a newer friend, but actually it turns out an older friend because we go back to history department days.
Ancient history.
Ancient history. Although neither of us is an ancient historian,
Not
we're
yet.
getting ancient.
Yeah.
Dr. Howard Padwa is an historian and health service researcher at UCLA's Integrated Substance Abuse Program. He has been an ISH researcher for the past 2 years and has been a really wonderful and substantial contributor to almost every discussion that we've had. So welcome to you, Howard. And last but not least, another, I don't know, intermediate term friend, shall we say?
14 years?
14 years, yeah. Called longish. Dr. Matt Williams. Matt is the Vice President of the Center for Anti-Semitism Research at the Anti-Defamation League, where he heads the development of rigorous research and answers to both long-standing and new questions about how to measure, understand, and prevent anti-Semitism. Matt, welcome to you. So I want to begin in somewhat personal terms by asking each of you, how did you come to the work that you are currently engaged in, with particular reference to the struggle to combat hate? And Aziza, I think we'll begin with you.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. I am so grateful to be here, seeing a lot of new faces and old faces, or folks who have been in a relationship for a long time. I come to this work, I feel like I was born into it. My mom decided, so she's a Christian Methodist from the Midwest, and she married a Palestinian Muslim. And they raised us together in a multi-faith household. And I was always forced to reconcile the question of where do you really belong? And I always felt like people's hate was everywhere. And slowly, as I was growing up, I realized that it wasn't hate always. It was curiosity that was just framed really not so great. And that how we are with one another makes a really big difference. But that the way we behave with each other is essential, especially if we're going to create spaces of belonging with one another, and if we're really going to confront the very things that cause harm to each other, sometimes without our knowing, and other times very much within our knowing. But like, what does it mean to do those things? And so that's why I really come to my work at NewGround, which is about bridging divides, but really building capacity for resilience to be able to have the hard conversations multiple ways to face the harm, to say, here's where we failed, here's where we're failing again and again and again, and here's where we're going to do better over and over again until we get it right. And so my work is really about where the rubber meets the road. It's deeply personal, but it's also based in now a couple of decades of experience of bringing different communities together who are willing to talk about the very specifics of where anti-Semitism lives among us, even when we feel like it doesn't, and where Islamophobia lives within us, even when we think that it doesn't, but where we can confront each other with love, with compassion, but very directly in a space that is constructed for the ability to be able to have a real conversation.
So I want to just follow up before we move to the others by talking about one of the most sensitive topics that we all encounter, and that certainly you encounter in your NewGround work. And I should just preface it by saying I've spent a lot of time in my life devoted to bringing peace and justice to Israel-Palestine. And in fact, I'm motivated in no small part because I think, as I go back and recall my earliest recollections, I saw the face of hate in that setting. And so I wonder if you can say a bit about how you navigate at NewGround and confront what may appear in kind of spontaneous fashion as hate, kind of a spontaneous emotional response. Is that part of your experience? I ask with some foreknowledge that it is.
You know, it's every part of the experience. You're spot on. So where it can, there was I've been part of so many different gatherings, and a lot of people will say, why do they hate us? And it's like the same question that is asked by different people from different backgrounds about each other. And at the root of it is this question is there space for me in this room? Is there space for my identity to be fully here? And sometimes when people feel like their identities aren't fully received and accepted, they have big reactions. They have big reactions for really big reasons. And so part of what we do is also grounding ourselves to be able to say, okay, people are having a big reaction. That means that there's something that's important to them. And me, as the receiver of what I might feel like is hate, I need to ground myself even further to ask a curious question that will disarm in a way that actually sees the human, that is saying, I'm not seen right here. And so it takes a lot of your own capacity to be able to, and willingness to sit through those really hard moments, because many times you just want to run the other direction. And then other times where you are having to confront things that you don't want to confront. And so, like, there was a beautiful symposium that our fellows organized 2 weeks ago. So people who go through our fellowship, or we have all sorts of programs. This program is a 10-month program for professionals, people who are willing to have rough draft spaces where they can talk about Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Israel, Palestine, and confront these specific things. And so if you can imagine a room similar to this one, with 100 people, and a full day of hard conversations. And slowly, like when they had people at different tables, so like you had some tables that focused first on Islamophobia, others did focus on anti-Semitism, and then the third group of tables that was about the connection between the two. And some of the connections, the conversations that we were moderating at those tables, initially, like, people's reactions were like, oh, they had such a strong reaction to even how Islamophobia was being defined, and they just called it offensive. It was like, okay, well, what's really under that? And so asking more questions connected with curiosity back to Islamophobia. And I think it takes a lot of patience, but you do come across it all the time. And I have to say the other part is that while it takes an enormous amount of will to stick to the work, it's exhausting, and you need to take care of your people at the end of the day as well. And having rest and space and pauses, like the other part of the symposium was that there's actually a healing space. Like whenever you're feeling a little too overwhelmed, there's a space for you to go and breathe. And it could be just under the tree outside, but there's a space for you to actually take a moment, to take a beat. And that's actually just as important when you're confronting each other and confronting some of that hate, because more often than not, I see people say, I'm not anti-Semitic. And other people say, well, this is how I'm receiving what you're saying. And I think it's and the same goes forward with Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian bias. I can't tell you, like, I'll walk into any discussion and the way I'm introduced, people will switch in or swap in Jordan for Palestine. And I'm like, okay. Well, here we go. Like, this is still like, so I start off with like the very beginning of, okay, here's who I am. I just need you to see who I am. And so I have to affirm it. And so I'm still working with my own rattled self and grounding, and then trying to listen again.
Yeah, I just want to pull out one really important theme in what you said, which is the humanizing encounter, the questioning. What do you mean? What does it mean to you? Is itself an important pathway to dissolve dehumanization, in the absence of which it's very hard to go about that way. All right, Howard, you were sort of operating innocently enough in the UCLA Integrated Substance Abuse Program when a call for proposals for the study of hate emerged, and you readily availed yourself of this opportunity. And the perennial question is why?
Solving addiction and homelessness is really easy, so I figured why not as well, just make the full trifecta. No, it's interesting because, as David mentioned, I did do my graduate studies in history, where I came very close to writing my dissertation actually on the history of fascism, looking at the history of hatred, how Enlightenment ideals, for those of you who are Frankfurt School fans, kind of morphed into the opposite of Enlightenment. Then I needed a job. So I got a job in the psychiatry department because history jobs are hard to get, right? And then from there, I wound up in the world of health services for people with substance use disorders and people who experience homelessness. The way I came to this was when I saw this call, actually a colleague who studies homelessness passed it on to me. And he said, what about people who hate homelessness? And I was like, huh. And what I thought about in particular was so many of the people we work with, people with addictions, people living on the street, are people who are already suffering so much, already going through so much pain. And then we step on them even further with a mix of neglect, contempt, and outright hostility. And I recall one client who I worked with who told the story about how she had several years when she was living on the street, and she noticed that when she had a dog with her, people would stop and give her money. When she did not have a dog with her, they did not. And what she said is, could you imagine people caring more about a dog than you? Talk about dehumanization. That's really, really what it is. So as for what brings me to this is a desire to understand that more. And then also, as I've been with ISH, I think I've realized that so much of these things, like you mentioned, discrimination, stigma, other nasty behaviors, aren't exactly hatred, but they're really, really bad. And it's also made me reflect, how often when I'm walking down the street, if someone asks for money, when's the last time I've invited them into my home? When's the last time I've paid for a hotel room for them? So it makes me think, is there hate in me? What is that? So trying to figure that out a little more is kind of what motivated me.
And can you just say a little bit more about the kind of work you've done in the 2 research programs that you've engaged in? Very briefly, just tell us how you actually engaged.
Right, so basically I engaged ISH. First, my initial project, the first year, was looking at hatred as experienced by people experiencing homelessness. So one of them was adding questions to an existing survey of people experiencing homelessness here in LA, asking about experiences of stigma and discrimination. And effectively, someone who's experiencing homelessness is about 12 times as likely as someone who's not to be a victim of violence. So looking at that and documenting that here in our own backyard. Then the other piece of that project I did with Dr. Groening, who we'll hear from later, is looking at television coverage of homelessness in Los Angeles on the local news, and basically seeing what is it the local news is saying? What are the ideas that are out there about homelessness? Then in the second year, a lot of what I learned in the first year, and this might be part of what we talk about later, is a lot of what I was studying really wasn't hatred, but other bad stuff. So I decided, let's go for the real stuff this time. And my current project, I'm having fun swimming around with my colleague Lincoln, who's here, in the cesspool of Twitter, looking at ways that different kinds of hateful discourse disseminate through different modes of communication. So text versus image versus video, kind of Marshall McLuhan's old dictum that the medium is the message, taking a look at how that applies to hateful discourse in hope of figuring out some ways to counter that kind of messaging and its dissemination.
Thank you. So Matt, when we met, you remind me 14 years ago, you were a doctoral student in Jewish education and Jewish history at Stanford University. Now, you are directing a Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
It's a great question, and it's an honor to be here with all of you on this in this conversation. So beyond sort of the obvious phenotypical identities I have, I grew up in southeastern Oklahoma. I'm American Indian, Sephardic, Jew, and at various points in my life I've experienced prejudice with any one of those sort of hats, if you will, on as an American Indian, as a Sephardic Jew within the Jewish community, and as a Jew experiencing anti-Semitism. But actually, most saliently, I come to this conversation with my identity as a nerd. I grew up in a different century, millennia, in a school that graduated a little over 50% of students from high school. So I liked learning, I liked reading, and that was already in of itself an out group. And I was bullied mercilessly as a nerd. And that's sort of just generally how I entered this space and always had an interest in how we create, identify, define, maintain, and reify outgroups. And even though I was in Jewish education, Jewish history, broadly education and history, that was in many ways my locus of study. And just like many good nerds, I ended up making a career-altering decision based on reading a peer-reviewed journal article. Effectively, a social scientist named Betsy Levy-Pollack wrote an article in 2020, 2021 about how surveys were for the first time in the last 70 years getting really good at studying hatred. Surveys were getting good at studying hatred. Anyone who's done survey research before knows of this concept called social desirability bias, right? Which is effectively on surveys, we like to be taller, skinnier, better looking, wealthier, and for a long time, we did not disclose how much we hated other people. That started changing about 5 years ago, according to her research, and surveys became a tool where you could actually study hostility. And I read that article and I was like, okay, I actually have to do something about this. So that's when I started looking for a position, came to ADL, and started really running a whole bunch of research teams that do a lot of different things, but among sort of the main ones is we do randomized controlled trials on what reduces anti-Semitism. But as a good graduate student, I learned that the study of Jews is the study of Jews in context and in comparison. So we always have different groups, whether that's Muslim Americans, Asian Americans, and we run interventions, messaging, treatments, education, public education, relative to those different groups, and relative to control and placebo groups. So you can envision what I do is almost like running a pharmaceutical company inside of a large NGO, designed to actually develop evidence around what bang for buck reduces prejudice in what is a really high salience environment that we're in right now.
Great, thank you. So you have given us a sense of outcome. I now would like to take us back to the beginning of the process and engage in the definitional arts, if you will. The ADL is a huge aggregator of data on instances of anti-Semitism and hate more generally. And so the question is, how actually do you and your colleagues understand hate? Let me just say, hate has been described as an emotion, a drive, a praxis, an ideology, a disorder. What kind of work goes into defining and refining the core definitions through which you pass your data? Can you explain that to us a little bit? Give us some insight into that.
Absolutely. So within the context of our own research, I would say I try extraordinarily hard not to define hate. And what I mean by that is that I try very hard to allow our participants who we want to study their hostility, as well as the individuals who we want to study the impact of perceived hostility or real hostility, define what it is we're trying to measure. In truth, I actually, when I started at ADL, I thought I was going to have a different kind of measurement problem. The first couple of instruments I designed were extraordinarily precise and sensitive because I thought I was going to have to make like really profound claims about like less than 2% of the US population or something like that. That was not the problem that I found. Sadly, there was way more of hate than I expected. But what I really try to do is allow our participants to define this. And what it really comes down to is thinking about how people think about themselves vis-a-vis others, how they think about the outgroups in their own lives and in their own sort of media consumption, which is an element of all of our lives, right? It's another dimension to this. And really allow them to give them as much space as possible, or as one of our researchers says, as much rope as possible, to talk about the outgroups in their lives. And then from there, we have observational data on what do they do to those outgroups, or what do they do because of those outgroups. We have attitudinal data. We have increasingly cognitive behavioral data. And what I try to do is keep as open as possible to all of the various streams in that interaction, in the definition of, or the intersection of how our research participants think about others and how they believe they themselves are thought of. One of the really, for lack of a term, crappy aspects of this work, and there's a lot of crappy stuff about this work, is that the intersection of how one perceives others and how one perceives how they are perceived are so entangled, which is people often will define outgroups based on how that group they envision thinks about them, right? So one of the things that we try extraordinarily hard to do is pay very close attention to those sort of entangled perceptions. And we design, every kind of instrument to really attach to that intersection as much as possible. Whether that's interview protocols, surveys, focus groups, that's really, I would say, the first third of what we study before we get into anything else.
I really appreciate the comprehensiveness of the answer, but I still want to come back to you and ask you, how do you define hate? That's all well good. How do you understand, after your time at the ADL and giving a lot of thought, and maybe even reading the work of your namesake, Matthew Williams, author of a big book called The Science of Hate.
Yeah.
How do you understand?
Not quite my namesake, but yes, exactly. For me, when we think about hatred at ADL, and we think about it as an object of study, and it rarely is, frankly speaking, the object of study. The object of study is usually something policy-oriented or behavioral-oriented. So how do we get people to stop doing this, or how do we get people to support why, right? But in terms of actual hatred, what we really do is we think about the motivation people have to define an outgroup, and then to reify that outgroup through not just policy behavior, but also through ascribed emotion. So in this particular context, when we think about hate, we really think about the elevation of an outgroup, the reification of an outgroup, in a negative context. And that's, broadly speaking, what we really try to study when we think about hate. Too abstract still?
No,
Okay.
I mean, it seems like a model that works for anti-Semitism. I wonder if it's a model, pardon me? Well, I wonder if it's a model that works for other groups about whom the claim is not made that they control the world. Right, that process of elevation that you just described.
Well, elevation in terms of import to people's identity, right? So, I mean, one of the guiding lights of the study of hate in the United States is a researcher named Susan Fisk, who has spent a number of years developing something called the stereotype content model. which broadly looks at the US population divided by people's perceptions along an axis of warmth and competence, right? So you have people who people think are in the low competence, low warmth category. Here, homeless folks or addicts is a really great example, right? We have people with high warmth, low competence, people with disabilities. And you can think of all the prejudices ascribed to that particular group. You have people with high warmth, high competence. What's fascinating is dog owners are in that group. Just to call back on that. And then you have, yes, yeah, exactly. And then you have, and in fact, actually on that note, one of the most important prejudice reduction campaigns in the history of the United States was actually undertaken by the Bush administration to move veterans from the low competence, low warmth category to the high competence, high warmth category. You all can think about that for a moment. And then you have the high competence, low warmth category, which are doctors, bankers, lawyers, Jews, Asian Americans, largely speaking, right? And in any of those outgroups, when people think of those as an outgroup, there is a reification of what it means to fall within that particular context. And when maybe elevation was the wrong term, but broadly it's the maintenance and the definition of someone in that kind of context that produces or is produced by that animosity that we study as hatred.
Aziza, maybe feel free to offer a less wonky answer than
Thank
that. How in your work do you understand hate? And for that matter, in your personal life?
Thank you. So I did a nice rabbit hole dive into hate and thinking about how it plays out in our different worlds. And so we had interviewed and had a really lengthy conversation with Christian Picciolini. He has a book, Breaking Hate. I highly recommend that you read it. It's still quite timely. But he talks about how hate can actually be it's a behavior, and it can, just as much as it's learned, it's unlearned. That there's certain potholes that exist in everyone's lives, whether it's like really big ACEs, like the things that happen in our world, but especially things like where we're having a hard time, where someone has died in our family, or where there's poverty, or feelings of not belonging, etc. And all these things are things that we can provide scaffolding around, mental health services, school support, other things, but for me, what it comes down to is processing. And like, do we have processing spaces for people to be able to work through really hard things for themselves and alongside with other people that help put up a mirror to them? And so at the heart of really like where I lean for my definition actually comes to James Baldwin, who said this really well in 1955. I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. Until we deal with pain, real grievance from real human beings, and we stop the pain and we find ways to collaborate more as a society, to address the pain, but also to create space where people can not only just express themselves, but where they're not silenced by each other, and when we can create spaces where I can still share every part of who I am as a human being, and you can, and like the whole idea is that we can create an actual community that Martin Luther King talked about, like a beloved community where every single person's like work is actually seen, and not just work. The final book that Martin Luther King Jr.'s words are published in is Chaos or Community. And he really makes a strong argument for dealing with the real issues that people are wrestling with. And until we deal with the real issues and we create space for people's processing, we're going to continue feeding a cycle of hate. And as humans, we're going to have challenges. I'm not saying that they're going to go away if we build all the scaffolding, but we can create systems around people and create the conditions in our schools, in our working lives, in our communities, where we are actually supporting each other to not just be our best selves, but to be the selves that show up in the moments of need, where we're dealing with grief, where we're dealing with really hard things, and we have a community around us who will help us as we try to process our own work.
That's great. I'm often drawn back to Baldwin's quote as well, especially when I think of that pernicious and seemingly inescapable cycle by which the victim becomes the victimizer, who then becomes the victim again, and on it goes, which plays out so much in the world we know. And we have to really devote our attention to thinking how can we break that cycle, and in this instance, begin to pain. Howard.
I really appreciate both of your perspectives, because even though I'm the one on the panel who works in the psychiatry department, I didn't think of this question through the mental health lens that you all did. It's interesting. I think, Matt, a lot of what you described kind of sounded like hatred as a maladaptive form of categorization, of perceiving things in the world. And Aziza, you seem to describe it very much as a product of maladaptive coping, maladaptive response to a very harsh world, an increasingly judgmental world. And I think both of those I agree with you, and definitely agree that those can be the engines of hatred without a doubt. But at the same time, you can't teach an old historian new tricks. I kind of have a wonkier intellectual idea of what hatred is, and it again goes back to when I was studying fascism as a graduate student. Took a seminar with Saul Friedlander. I'm not sure if this is a phrase that he used or another historian used, but talked about the fascist minimum. What is it if you were going to call a right-wing thinker in 1925 a fascist? What would make him a fascist versus just a conservative, versus just a bigot, versus other things? And the big question was, what is that minimum, what is not? And I think that's important to realize, because calling someone a fascist, that's really name-calling. That's a very serious accusation. And similarly, calling someone or something hateful, or someone as hating, is a very, very serious accusation. And to your point, people react defensively to it. So I think it's really critical to have some real precision when we talk about it. So the way I've come to think about it, and this is thanks in large part to Mario's comments in our ISH seminars and others, is what is the hateful minimum? And I kind of come to three things. One is actually very much in common with fascism, which is anti-universalism. The idea that we're all the same, that we're all brothers and sisters in humanity is not true. There's something about group A, B, or C, my pathological categorization, that makes you fundamentally different from me. Category number two, and this is where I think the homelessness example doesn't quite map on to hatred, is righteous cruelty. When we think about October 7th, when we think about 9/11, when you think of other infamous dates in history, a lot of what you're talking about is cruelty, and people who think what they're doing, it's not just a means to an end, I have to, if I don't do this to them, they're going to do it to me. But actually that this is the right thing to do, and I am being righteous in doing so. And then number three is absolute certainty in the first two things. Absolute certainty that we are not all the same, and absolute certainty that my cruelty to you is a good thing. And that, I think, is very much a product fed by our current information ecosystem, speaking to as to how that happens, how that's happening more now. But also, I think if you look at times of, if you look at claims of hatred, generally they are with a certain certainty and closed-mindedness that I think animates it all.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate the fact that you laid out your criteria for the hateful minimum. I want to take up the second, righteous cruelty, and try to understand a little bit better how you see hate figuring in it. It seems to me what is at work there is a process of first stigmatization, categorization, you said, and dehumanization. And so, you're someone who's attentive to the different valences of terms that seem to be synonymous with hate or hate adjacent. So can you say a little bit more about where you think this kind of dehumanization is either animated by hate or, as scholars of hate have told us, emerges as an outcome of hate? What is the distinction, if any, you see between dehumanization and hate? And maybe I'll ask you to distinguish a few more terms after we get through that.
I'd say dehumanization is a precondition, but certainly not sufficient for hatred. One thing I think about is also the matter of the intention. And this is where, it sounds very strange, but a lot of terrible things that we think of hateful don't meet my definition because they lack that sadism, they lack that desire to inflict harm and pain. Thinking back, for example, to the eugenics movement. These are a lot of the same people who also were really trying to care, really thought they were providing services to help humanity and help people with intellectual disabilities, and they wound up sterilizing them. Terrible tragedy. Well-intentioned, hateful, that's the question. So I think that that's kind of the big difference, is whether the act is meant to inflict harm and suffering.
Right. That degree of intentionality that goes into the second term in your frame, cruelty. Matt, did you want to jump in? Go ahead.
I bet he disagrees.
This is a foreshadowed on the pre-panel call that we have. I think that gives the perpetrator way too much credit, which is when I think about the entanglement of people who experience hate and people who are producing hate, I try extraordinarily hard to center the voices and the lived experience of people who see themselves as experiencing hate and hostility. And for them, intentionality is a second order, if that, criteria. And in that particular context, when I think about the experience of hate, I'm curious to turn the question back, how you think about the experience of hate as perceived by people who are experiencing it, even if it lacks the intention on the part of the perpetrator.
It doesn't. I think that's a great point. I think that thinking again about the folks that I work with, the folks who are suffering from substance use disorders, the folks who are living on the street, generally the things that they experience, the slights that they experience, and even if you think about a lot of things that you may even see in certain forms of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, is people who think they know the other group but don't. And I think a lot of it isn't intended. And I think with hate, that's a big thing, because again, if someone does something to me that's hurtful and I say that's being hateful, yes, it'll get their attention. But it's also, I think, kind of an accusation in a way. So I think that the impact can be the same either way, to your point, because dehumanization and discrimination have the same impact either way.
This is such an interesting question. I mean, I often ask myself this, the intent-effect distinction. Who should define, say, in the case that's of interest to us as researchers, who should define what anti-Semitism is? Is the victim of anti-Semitism the best reporter, or perhaps the perpetrator? And I often think, when one thinks of the extraordinary malleability of anti-Semitism, it's the perpetrator who defines best what anti-Semitism is.
It's actually such a great question, because unlike almost every other type of hatred, scholars, largely historians and literary scholars of anti-Semitism, don't study Jews. They don't study people who experience that. In fact, there's a dearth of victimization literature in the entire field of anti-Semitism. It is utterly bizarre on some level, and it's a fascinating sort of a piece that we can talk about at some other point in time. But for me, I mean, I'll go back to sort of basics here, which is it depends on what you want to do. It depends on your research question. If you want to help people who experience anti-Semitism heal, then that's really what you want to take seriously. If you want to learn how to prevent or reduce anti-Semitism, then let's talk about perpetrators.
Right, just to go to the historical question, which we could really go into a deep dive about, part of the answer to the question, why is so much research focused on perpetrators, is because the perpetrators give voice and lay out in great detail what the underlying ideology and praxis is, whereas victims tend not to the same sense. Wait, I'm gonna move on. Okay, I'm gonna move on because we need to wrap up soon, and I want Aziza to have the last word. Your assessment of maybe the last decade, which you've been able to chronicle very carefully through your work at NewGround. There seems to have been, certainly in the case of anti-Semitism, an explosion since 2015. Certainly, I think a common rise in Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian sentiment, anti-Asian sentiment. How do you understand that last decade? And I suppose sort of what really underlies it, the interconnectivity of these various nodal points of hate in a wider ecosystem. I mean, you have access to two key nodal points in your work. I'm just sort of curious how you see the relationship between them and others as part of the ecosystem.
You know what's terrifying right now is that numbers of hate are going up, and then there's a sharp incline across the board. And so it's not that like one is suffering, it's all are suffering. And actually, the relationship, like when, as you see Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian stuff rise, anti-Semitism is also on the rise. And it's example after example of humans wrestling with really hard things. And I just want to go back to something Matt had brought up earlier in the definition. And so what we do in our space is, it's actually really important that all the people in this space give voice to how they are coming across the thing that we're talking about, whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. And while I understand that some folks will say, like, you know, Jews should be able to only define anti-Semitism, or Jews should be able to only define Zionism, whatever it is, I think what's really essential is actually when you have multiple voices in a room and they're from different vantage points or perspectives, they bring in really important dimensions that you wouldn't see otherwise. And so I guess, and the other part is that it's actually, it helps you see the blind spots. And so I guess my challenge today is to all of us is like, where are the blind spots? Like when you're actually measuring anti-Semitism at the ADL and you're asking questions about how it's rising and Palestinian protests are also somehow measured in there, I would hope that you could actually include Palestinian voices who are seasoned in wanting to actually confront hate, to be part of whatever focus group to help ask the questions. Because I think that sometimes we ask questions and we absolutely don't know what any types of groups, because different people are different people, right? And they have different opinions in different pieces. Like what I realized really, like especially like it hit me in the face when I went to Israel-Palestine a year and a half ago, is as I was walking around looking at different places where my grandfather had been put in jail and all these places, what I realized is the history that I knew was nowhere. It was absolutely nowhere. And so how can you have an opinion about somebody when you have no idea, when the only thing that exists of them is some weird caricature about some bumbling, idiotic Arab, and that's the only representation of a Palestinian. And I think that like the more we can actually include each other in each other's focus groups, we can actually strengthen the data and the ability to process and figure out what to do with it.
I just want to say on that note that we have, as part of our Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia Research Hubs, as part of ISH, a new feature of ISH, an undergraduate team exploring both Muslim and Jewish student attitudes that begin that work or begin to realize the promise that you've just laid out for us, Aziza. I know I could continue talking with my friends for a very long time. It's been a very rich conversation, but we have other really wonderful and important presentations to hear, and I want to be respectful of our time. So please join me in thanking Howard, Aziza, and Matt for a very rich conversation.